Time for questions after the presentation. My name is Marina, and I'm a co-founder of the European Crypto Initiative, which is an advocacy group that works in Brussels. So we are talking to the regulators that want to regulate crypto, DeFi, centralized exchanges, wallets, etc.
Hi, I'm Florian, another co-founder of this initiative. We are both attorneys, so we're very excited to tell you about regulation in Europe and also how it affects other ecosystems like the American one. Please, Marina, go ahead.
So today we're talking about the regulation of DeFi. As of today, we don't have any regulation specifically tailored to DeFi, not even in the EU. As you well know, there are some regulations that are specifically targeted centralized exchanges or centralized service providers, but not yet DEXs. So we'll tell you a little bit about some of the strategies that we can use or we can use when talking to regulators, because they are definitely thinking about how to regulate DeFi too, at least in Europe. So to predict the future, let's start it with the past. Let's see how last year was. So after the really negative news from mostly centralized entities like Celsius and FTX, that's misappropriated our funds and basically committed fraud, it was not a very positive feedback to the regulators and to the outside world. Even within our community, we were not very happy of how these funds were used. So the result, in a way, was very imminent, was immediate. In the US, there was a lot of discussion around regulating centralized exchanges, preventing FTX from happening. In the EU, we already had the markets in crypto assets regulation, which has already been almost finalized. So there were not major changes when regulating exchanges. But what is also very interesting and important is that there's a lot of international organizations like the Financial Stability Board, OECD, and others that are looking into DeFi this year. So for them, this year, 2023, is the year of DeFi. And at the end of this year, we're going to see all these reports finalized, and they will definitely influence also local jurisdictions like the EU and the US. So why do you need to learn about the EU? Why are we even talking about it? The EU has finalized the first regulation on crypto assets, which is called the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, and it regulates the issuance of crypto assets and also crypto asset service providers. Only last week, there was the US delegation coming to Brussels to learn more about this regulation, and we are seeing an increased interest from other jurisdictions into what the EU regulators are doing. So basically, what Mika says is opposed to what we hear lately from the US regulators, and especially the SEC. Most of the tokens you use today, so most of the utility tokens are not going to be securities. They're going to be crypto assets, speaking from the legal point of view, which means that they're going to be a completely new asset that never existed before, and there's no discussion about them being commodities or securities. We just invented a completely new asset class, and that, I think, is quite positive. Among those crypto assets, we have utility tokens, and we have also stablecoins. So in Europe, stablecoins are not securities or financial instruments, as we call them. They mostly are going to be e-money tokens that were regulated very similarly even before crypto even existed. It's called e-money, and it was a digital money that it was used before in Europe. So just to recap on what's happening this year, 2023, we have new regulation in Europe on crypto assets. We have regulation on AML, anti-money laundering, dictating KYCing for a lot of different activities. And we have a lot of activity also coming from the SEC, but not a regulation, as you well know. And as I mentioned, a lot of reports coming from international organizations thinking about DeFi. And now let's go to Florian. He will tell us what will happen in the future.
Thank you. I get my own microphone now. Yeah, so what about DeFi, right? So Europe regulated crypto assets, it regulated stablecoins, but it has not yet. It's a laptop. Okay, thank you very much. DeFi hasn't been regulated yet, and the EU is thinking more and more about how to do that. And there was a report, some research commissioned by the EU on what various approaches to DeFi regulation could look like. And I just want to go with you through the ones that we've seen so far. So one proposal is to restrict DeFi regulation to activities of regulated entities that want to venture into DeFi. So you're, a regulated exchange, you want to offer some DeFi products, or you're a bank and you want to offer yield farming to your unsuspecting customers, then you would have to basically register with the authorities and register your wallets to make it more transparent. So that's one proposal. It would really not regulate DeFi in a more strict sense. It would really be only regulating the periphery around it. Another proposal we saw in this report that the Commission commissioned is this idea of a voluntary compliance framework. You could also call this a sandbox. We haven't really seen sandboxes take off anywhere in the past. So unclear whether this is something that is really going to happen in Europe. Another proposal is this idea of a public observatory for DeFi. So this would be almost like before any concrete regulation, the regulators would basically set up observatories to understand, what are people even doing in this market. The question is, of course, with ZK technology on the horizon, how much public observability is there really going to be in the near-term future, right? So that's a big question. And I think another really interesting one is this idea of regulating oracles, since oracles have such a critical role to play in DeFi protocols for pricing of assets. They are obviously a weak spot. We've seen it with Mango markets. We've seen it with other sorts of cases in the past. If the oracle falls, typically the protocol falls. So there is, I think, a high likelihood that oracles will become sort of regulated. In order to understand how the DeFi regulation will go, let's look at how MiCA, so this now already existing crypto asset regulation in Europe, went. The way it went is that basically the Commission ideated this piece of law in 2019. It publicized their idea in 2020. And then 2 years later, in 2022, there was a political agreement on what this regulation should look like. And now in 2024, it will be finally applicable. So you can see about 5 years between ideation and entry into force. So if you look at this MiCA 2, so the potential DeFi regulation, dedicated DeFi regulation in Europe, basically we're now in 2023, which is the equivalent of something like 2019, 2020 compared to the previous regulation. So we can expect that in about 26, 27, 28, this new law should enter into force. And what it really means is that now is the time to get engaged in Europe in order to have impact and influence on this regulation. So we want to ask all of you, what in your mind would a good regulation of DeFi look like? Should it be regulated at all? If so, what are the kinds of things that we need to sort of introduce in terms of rules into this market in order to scale to a mass consumer adoption? And you've seen some of the proposals from the Commission. I went through them. I'm sure there are many more good ideas. We had a workshop yesterday with some people there. We focused on this idea of information asymmetry, Where are information asymmetries in DeFi? You know, let's say you're running an interface and you get a lot of information about order flow. You can front run people. Is that an information asymmetry that should be regulated in DeFi? So a lot of ways to think about what good regulation could be like. UCI is your place and your community to actually have influence on this. So scan this QR code, join our Telegram, and help us, you know, shape the future regulation of DeFi in Europe, and by extension, most likely the way DeFi is going to be regulated in other places like the US and other jurisdictions. So that's it from me, and I think
we are done right at a time, so thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, everybody.